I knew something was seriously wrong when I walked into the server room and found my custom Minus built backup Array unplugged and shoved into the corner like yesterday's garbage. That machine had kept our network running through 3 major outages, to CEO changes, and one particularly nasty ransomware attempt that never made the news because I caught it in time. The LED east at a slight sword arc, the cooling fan silent, and 24 years of careful engineering reduced to just another piece of obsolete equipment waiting for the dumpster. But apparently, it wasn't Cloud Minus compatible enough for Hunter Wright, our new CTO. Name's Mason Rodriguez, 49 years old, and I've been keeping this company's network infrastructure alive since 1999. That's back when most people thought the internet was just a fattened wireless meant your cordless phone had good range. I came here straight from the Navy, where I had spent 6 years working on communication systems aboard destroyers in the Pacific Fleet. Those Navy years taught me things you can't learn in any computer science program. When you're responsible for radar and communication systems on a ship full of sailors 200 miles from the nearest land, you learn to build redundancy into everything. You learn that fancy new technology fails at the worst possible moment, and that the guy who understands the old systems is worth his weight in gold when everything goes sideways. More importantly, those were the years I developed the network compression protocol that would later become my ticket to financial independence, though I didn't know it at the time. It started in 1998 during my last deployment. We were having bandwidth issues minus too much critical data trying to squeeze through communication channels that were designed in the 1980 seconds. The standard compression algorithms weren't cutting it, and Command was getting frustrated with delayed intelligence reports and choppy video feeds for reconnaissance drones. So I spent my off-minus hours in the comm center, working on a better solution. 8 months of testing, debugging, and rebuilding code from scratch. The breakthrough came during a particularly rough storm in the South China Sea. We were losing satellite connectivity every few minutes, and I realized the problem wasn't just bandwidth minus, it was packet optimization. My algorithm needed to anticipate connection drops and pre-minus compress data in a way that maintained integrity even with interrupted transmission. The final version could compress network data by 40% while actually improving transmission reliability. Command was impressed enough to fast-minus track a commendation, but more importantly, they let me keep the intellectual property rights when I separated from the service. Most guys don't think about that stuff minus, they figure military minus developed tech belongs to Uncle Sam. But I'd done this on my own time, using my own equipment, solving a problem that had civilian applications way beyond naval communications. When I walked into Nexus Technologies in March 1999, fresh out of the Navy with my protocol perfected and documented, I knew I had something valuable. The company was smaller than minus maybe 200 employees, mostly handling data processing contracts for insurance companies and regional banks. Rick Spencer, the hiring manager, was an ex-Air for Sky himself, so he understood what I was bringing to the table. This compression technology, he said, studying the performance benchmarks I'd shown him. This could save our clients serious money on bandwidth costs. That's the idea, I replied. But I want to make sure I'm properly compensated if the company uses it commercially. Most places would have balked at that kind of request from a new hire. But Rick was smart, and he could see the numbers. My protocol would give them a competitive advantage in an industry where data transfer costs were eating into profit margins, so he worked with their lawyers to add specific language to my employment contract minus any proprietary technology I developed or brought to the company would entitle me to ongoing royalty payments based on commercial usage. Looking back, I realized Rick probably saved his company millions in licensing fees by keeping that technology in minus house. But he also created a ticking time bomb that wouldn't go off for another 24 years. The early days were good. I set up their network infrastructure from scratch, implemented my protocol as the backbone of their data processing pipeline, and watched the company grow. We landed bigger contracts, hired more people, moved into a larger building. My compression system was handling more data every month, saving clients money and making the company a reputation for efficiency. I became the go-minus guy for anything network-minus related. When systems crashed, they called me. When clients had technical questions, they called me. When new hires needed training on our proprietary systems, they sent them to me. I wasn't just an employee minus, I was institutional knowledge, walking around in a polo shirt and work boots. For 2 decades, that arrangement worked perfectly. The company made money using my technology. I got paid a good salary plus annual bonuses, and everyone was happy. I trained dozens of junior technicians, mentored new engineers, and built systems that just kept working year after year. But nothing lasts forever in corporate America. Hunter Wright blew in like a Category 5 hurricane in August 2022, armed with an MBA from Stanford and absolutely convinced that everything built before 2020 was holding the company back. At 35, he spoke fluent buzzword and saw legacy infrastructure the way other people saw asbestos minus something dangerous that needed immediate professional removal. His first all minus hands meeting was a masterclass in corporate doublespeak, digital transformation, cloud minus native solutions, operational efficiency through modernization. Every sentence was a carefully crafted way of saying the same thing: out with the old, in with the expensive. Hunter started his campaign subtly, the way smart corporate predators always do. First, he moved my server rack out of the main data center. Space optimization, he called it, but I knew better. He wanted my custom hardware out of sight, where visiting executives wouldn't see the old minus school equipment that actually kept the lights on. Then came the consulting team from Seattle minus 5 guys in matching polo shirts, who charged more per day than most people make in a month. They spent 3 weeks documenting our current state architecture, which was a fancy way of saying they took screenshots of my network diagrams and rewrote them using cloud terminology. Their final presentation was a thing of beauty, in a train minus wreck sort of way. Slide after slide explaining how our legacy infrastructure was costing the company millions in technical debt and operational inefficiency. They had charts showing how much money we'd save by migrating everything to Amazon Web Services. They had timelines for sunsetting legacy applications and right-sizing our technology footprint. What they didn't have was any understanding of why those legacy systems existed in the first place. I sat through that presentation, watching Hunter nod along like he personally discovered fire. When they got to the slide about eliminating redundant on minus premise infrastructure, I saw him glance my way with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He knew exactly what he was doing. Questions? Hunter asked when the consultants finished their pitch. I raised my hand. What's the fallback plan when AWS goes down? Because they do go down, usually during quarterly earnings calls or major product launches when you need them most. One of the consultants, a kid who looked like he'd gotten his technical knowledge from YouTube videos, started explaining cloud redundancy and geographic distribution. I let him talk for about 2 minutes before I interrupted. I've seen geographic redundancy fail. I've seen load balancers crash and take down entire regions. When that happens, you need local systems that can operate independently. That's not paranoia minus, that's 24 years of experience keeping critical systems running. Hunter's smile got tighter. Well, Mason, that's exactly the kind of legacy thinking we need to move beyond. Modern cloud infrastructure has built minus and redundancy that makes local backup systems obsolete. The room went quiet. Everyone knew what he just said wasn't technically true, but nobody wanted to argue with the new CTO and his expensive consultants. I bit my tongue and made a mental note to update my resume. That meeting was the beginning of the end, though it took another 8 months for Hunter to work up the courage to actually fire me. Instead, he started the slow squeeze minus death by 1,000 corporate cuts. First, he stopped inviting me to architecture meetings. Then he hired a cloud migration specialist named Trevor Kim, some hotshot from Silicon Valley who talked a good game about Kubernetes and microservices, but couldn't troubleshoot a DNS issue if his life depended on it. Trevor was making $40,000 more than me, according to the salary disclosure requirements our state had just passed. Ashley Torres, our HR director, started scheduling monthly career development conversations with me. Ashley was one of those HR professionals who treated employee relations like a chess game, where she already knew how it would end. She'd ask questions about my long minus term career goals and whether I'd ever considered exploring opportunities in the broader market. Meanwhile, Hunter was systematically dismantling everything I'd built. He migrated our email system to Office 365, which promptly crashed during the company's biggest client presentation of the year. He moved our file storage to SharePoint, which somehow managed to lose 3 weeks of accounting data that we eventually recovered from my obsolete backup tapes. Each failure was explained away as transition challenges or temporary growing pains. Hunter had an excuse for everything, and upper management seemed happy to believe him as long as the monthly cloud bills looked impressive in PowerPoint presentations. The breaking point came during a Monday morning, all minus hands meeting in January 2023. Hunter was presenting his quarterly review, showing graphs of modernization progress and infrastructure optimization. One slide caught my attention. It showed network performance metrics for the past 6 months, with a note about legacy protocol dependencies that were limiting scalability. That legacy protocol was my compression algorithm, the one I developed in the Navy, the one that had been processing 80% of the company's data traffic for 24 years, the one that was literally saving them millions in bandwidth costs, though Hunter's presentation somehow failed to mention that detail. When he opened it up for questions, I couldn't help myself. Hunter, that legacy protocol you mentioned, are you planning to replace it? Eventually, yes. We're evaluating modern compression solutions that integrate better with cloud native architectures. And what will that cost? He consulted his notes. The vendor quotes are still coming in, but we're looking at approximately $300,000 annually for enterprise grade compression services, plus implementation costs. I did the math in my head. $300,000 a year to replace technology that was currently running for free, technology that actually worked better than anything they could buy. It was like buying bottled water when you had a perfectly good well in your backyard. Have you considered the performance impact? I asked. Third party compression adds latency and creates additional failure points. Hunter's patience was wearing thin. Mason, these are exactly the kinds of concerns that prevent organizations from innovating. Sometimes you have to accept short term challenges to achieve long term benefits. That's when I knew for certain he was going to fire me. You don't lecture someone about innovation in front of their colleagues unless you're already planning their exit strategy. 2 weeks later, Ashley Torres called me into the conference room. You know, the one windowless, fluorescent lighting, smelling like industrial carpet and broken dreams. She had that practiced expression managers use when they're about to deliver bad news, but want to seem compassionate about it. Mason, we need to discuss your role here, she started, sliding a manila folder across the table. The company is restructuring our IT operations, and unfortunately, your position is being eliminated. There it was. 20 for years of institutional knowledge, and I was being eliminated like a line item in a budget spreadsheet. The folder contained the usual corporate farewell package minus severance details, CEO BRA information, and a non-disclosure agreement that basically said I couldn't talk about why they'd fired me. This decision comes directly from Hunter, I asked. From executive leadership, yes. It's part of our broader modernization initiative. I nodded once and picked up the folder. Is this final? Ashley leaned back with that corporate smile that never touches the eyes. I'm afraid so. We appreciate everything you've contributed over the years, but we need to position the company for future growth. Future growth. Right. They were positioning themselves for a $300,000 annual bill to replace technology I'd given them for free. I walked out to my truck and sat there for a few minutes, just thinking. 20 for years of keeping their systems running. And I got handed a pink slip because some MBA decided experience was a liability. The parking lot looked the same as it had that first day in 1999 when I'd walked in with my Navy discharge papers and a head full of technical knowledge that most civilian companies barely understood. But sitting there, staring at that building where I'd spent more time than my own house, something Rick Spencer had told me during my hiring interview came floating back. Mason, this contract language about intellectual property make sure you keep copies of everything. Corporate lawyers have short memories, especially when money's involved. I'd been young and naive enough to think that was just standard advice. Now I realized Drake had been trying to protect me from exactly this situation. I drove home and went straight to my home office, a spare bedroom I converted into a workshop where I kept my personal servers and testing equipment. In the filing cabinet, buried behind tax returns and insurance papers, I found the folder I'd labeled employment minus original contract. I made 3 copies back in 1999, just like Rick suggested. One for my files, one for safe deposit box, and one that I'd scanned and backed up to multiple drives because old habits from the Navy die hard. The contract was 23 pages of legal language, but I knew exactly what I was looking for. Page 17. Section 8.3 Employee Intellectual Property Rights on Royalty Compensation. There it was. In black and white, any proprietary technology, algorithms, or processes developed by employee prior to or during employment, if utilized commercially by company, shall entitle employee to ongoing royalty payments equal to 2% of gross revenue attributable to said technology, calculated annually. 2%. For 24 years, on a compression protocol that handled 80% of their data processing. I pulled out my calculator and started running numbers. According to their last annual report, Nexus Technologies had gross revenues of $25 million. If my protocol was processing 80% of that, I was looking at roughly $400,000 per year in royalty payments they'd never made. Times 24 years, my hands were shaking a little as I reached for the phone. Jordan Hayes answered on the second ring. Jordan and I had served together on the USS Fitzgerald, and he'd been the guy you called when you needed something figured out fast. After the Navy, he'd gone to law school and specialized in intellectual property and employment law. We'd stayed in touch over the years minus barbecues, holidays, the occasional fishing trip. Mason, he said, and I could hear kids laughing in the background. Please tell me you're calling because you finally decided to take that retirement cruise we've been talking about. They fired me today, Jordan. The background noise stopped. Sons of, hold on, let me get somewhere I can talk. I heard it or close. Then Jordan's voice came back. All business now. Tell me everything. I walked him through the whole thing minus Hunter's modernization campaign, the systematic undermining, Ashley's termination meeting. When I got to the part about the contract clause, Jordan went quiet for a long moment. Mason, are you absolutely certain your protocol is still running their systems? I built it into everything they do. Email processing, file transfers, database queries, client communications minus it's all running through my compression algorithm. Has been for 24 years, and they never renegotiated your contract? Never tried to buy out the IP rights? Never even mentioned it. I don't think they remember that clause exists. Jordan whistled low. Brother, you just hit the lottery. I need to see that contract and any documentation you have about the protocol's usage. But if what you're telling me is accurate, how much are we talking about? Conservatively, based on 2% of their revenue stream over 24 years, plus compound interest and penalties for non-minus payment. We're looking at minimum for $80 million. Could be more if we can prove willful infringement. I sat there staring at my computer screen, watching status lights blink on the server I'd built to test network protocols back when Jordan and we were still wondering what we'd do after the Navy. 20 minus for years later, that same technology was about to change everything. What do we need to do? First, document everything. I need network logs, system architecture diagrams, anything that shows how extensively they're using your protocol. Then we file a formal notice with their legal department. Give them a chance to respond before we escalate. And if they don't respond, then we sue them for 24 years of unpaid royalties, plus interest, plus damages for willful copyright infringement. Trust me, they'll respond. I spent the next 2 days pulling together documentation, network performance reports, system architecture diagrams, email chains where I'd explained how the compression protocol worked. Every piece of evidence I could find that showed how central my technology was to their operations. The funny thing about being the guy who built the systems minus I documented everything. Not out of paranoia, just professional habit. When you're responsible for keeping critical infrastructure running, you leave breadcrumbs for whoever comes after you. I had 24 years of breadcrumbs showing exactly how my protocol had evolved and expanded throughout their network. Jordan's formal notice went out on a Thursday morning. 3 pages of polite legal language explaining that my termination had triggered a review of my 1999 employment contract, specifically the intellectual property provisions that had apparently been overlooked for more than 2 decades. The response was immediate and panicked. My phone started ringing before lunch. Ashley Torres left 3 voicemails asking if we could discuss this situation privately. The company's general counsel, Richard Hoffman minus a guy I'd maybe spoken to twice in 24 years minus, suddenly wanted to have lunch and clear up any misunderstandings. I didn't answer any of them. I did what I'd always done when systems were failing minus. I monitored the situation and waited to see how they'd react under pressure. And boy, did they react. Within 48 hours, word was spreading through the company that they were facing a major intellectual property lawsuit from their former network engineer. The stock price dropped 3 points when some financial blog picked up the story about legacy employment contract liability affecting Nexus Technologies. But the real chaos was happening inside the building. According to Trevor Kim, the cloud migration specialist who'd been hired to replace me, Hunter had called an emergency meeting with the entire IT department. They'd finally realized that the legacy protocol they'd been planning to replace was actually proprietary technology owned by the guy they'd just fired. Better yet, they were starting to discover just how integral that protocol was to their operations. When Trevor tried to run a test migration without it, data transfer speeds dropped by 40% and several client connections timed out completely. The backup systems I'd built over 24 years weren't just redundant minus. They were load minus bearing walls in a house of cards that Hunter had been systematically dismantling. By Friday afternoon, 3 major clients had called to complain about slower response times and connection issues. One of them, a regional bank that processed transactions 24/7, was threatening to review their contract if performance didn't improve immediately. Hunter Wright, the man who'd eliminated my position to save money, was about to learn exactly how much that decision was going to cost them. 3 weeks into the legal battle, Richard Hoffman called me directly. Not through lawyers, not through Ashley, just him on my personal cell at 7:30. I am on a Tuesday morning. I could hear the desperation in his voice before he even said hello. Mason, we need to talk. I'm listening. This intellectual property situation minus nobody knew about that royalty clause. It got buried in old contract files when we switched HR systems back in 2010. The digital conversion team must have missed it. That's your problem, not mine, Richard. There was a long pause, and I could hear muffled voices in the background. Sounded like he was in a conference room full of very unhappy people. The board is prepared to make this right. We're talking about a significant settlement. Define significance. $2 million, plus a confidentiality agreement. Clean break. No admission of wrongdoing. Everyone moves on. I almost laughed. Richard, you've been using my technology commercially for 24 years without paying a dime in royalties. Your own system logs show it processes over 80% of your data traffic. $2 million doesn't even cover the interest on what you actually owe me. What's your number? I'd been waiting for this question. Jordan and I had run the calculations a dozen different ways, looked at comparable intellectual property settlements, factored in compound interest and penalties for willful infringement. For $0.8 million. No. Confidentiality agreement. And I keep all rights to the protocol going forward. The silence stretched long enough that I thought he might have hung up. That's a substantial amount, Mason. That's a fair amount. Your choice is to pay me what you legally owe, or explain to your shareholders why you're getting sued by the guy who built the technology that runs your company. I'm betting the shareholders would have some interesting questions about how senior management managed to overlook a multi-million-dollar liability for more than 2 decades. I need to discuss this with the board. You do that. But Richard, while you're discussing, you might want to ask Hunter how much it's going to cost to replace my protocol. I heard the quotes are coming back around $300,000 annually for inferior technology that'll slow down your network and create new security vulnerabilities. Another week of negotiations, with Jordan handling the details while I watched the company tear itself apart from the outside. The stock price kept dropping as word spread through the industry about Nexus Technologies' legacy infrastructure liability. 3 more clients complained about performance issues. One major account put their contract renewal on hold pending stability improvements. Hunter Wright was fighting for his professional life, calling emergency meetings with department heads and bringing in additional consulting teams to find ways around the protocol dependency. But there's no workaround for fundamental architecture, especially when that architecture has been optimized over 24 years by someone who actually understood the underlying systems. The breakthrough came when Rever Kim, Hunter's hand-spicked replacement for me, accidentally crashed the entire email system trying to implement a temporary compression solution. The outage lasted 6 hours and took down client communication for half the eastern seaboard. Emergency repair costs alone hit $180,000, not counting the client penalties they'd have to pay for missing service-level agreements. That's when the board finally stepped in. Ashley Torres was the first casualty. Her termination was announced in a brief email citing procedural failures during personnel transitions. No farewell party, no thank you for your service speech. Just gone. Hunter lasted another week before pursuing other opportunities in the technology sector. The settlement papers arrived on a Friday afternoon. For $0.8 million. No confidentiality restrictions, and a licensing agreement that would pay me ongoing royalties for as long as they used the technology, which, given how integral it was to their operations, would probably be forever. Jordan called me after the money hit my account. Congratulations, brother. You just became the most expensive termination in corporate history. What about Hunter? Word is he's having trouble finding another CTO position. Turns out, firing the guy who owns the intellectual property rights to your core technology counts as a pretty serious screw minus up in executive circles. I could have retired on the spot, bought a sailboat, moved somewhere warm, spent my days fishing and reading technical journals for fun instead of necessity. But 24 years of solving problems doesn't just disappear because your bank account gets bigger. Instead, I started Rodriguez Network Solutions, specializing in infrastructure consulting for mid-size businesses. Turns out, there's a huge demand for someone who actually knows how to build systems instead of just talking about them. My Navy background and decades of real-world experience opened doors that Hunter's MBA never could. 6 months later, my phone rang with a familiar number. Nexus Technologies. Mr. Rodriguez, this is Jennifer Walsh, the new CTO at Nexus. I understand you have experience with our network infrastructure. The new CTO. Hunter's replacement. I had to appreciate the irony. Some experience, yes. We're having performance issues with our recent cloud migration, and several consultants have recommended that we engage someone familiar with our legacy systems. Would you be available for a consulting contract? I quoted my standard rate. $500 per hour, 6-month minimum engagement. That seems reasonable given the complexity of the project. Reasonable. They were paying me more in 1 month than they used to pay me in an entire year, and they thought it was reasonable. The first day back in that building was surreal. Walking through halls where I'd spent 24 years, past the server room where my custom hardware was still humming away in the corner, still keeping their systems running despite being obsolete and inefficient. Jennifer turned out to be competent minus from our military herself. Air Force Communications, someone who understood that reliable systems matter more than buzzwords. She'd inherited Hunter's mess and was smart enough to know she needed help cleaning it up. Your compression protocol. She said during our first meeting, the performance metrics show it's actually superior to the cloud-based solutions we've been testing. That's what 24 years of optimization will do. Would you consider licensing an updated version? Something designed specifically for hybrid cloud environments. And that's how I ended up not just getting paid for the technology they've been using for free, but getting hired to improve it even further. Sometimes the old systems really do work better than the shiny new ones. You just have to know how to read the fine print. Sometimes the most expensive lesson a company can learn is that experience is an overhead minus its insurance, and the premium for ignoring it is always higher than the cost of respecting it. In a world obsessed with disruption and digital transformation, The real power belongs to those who built the systems everyone else takes for granted minus, because when you own the foundation, you control the building.